Thanks for the introduction, Matt. I'm going to talk a little bit today about my professional history and the development models that we've really been refining over the past 10, 12 years. Before I do, I've never been in a public forum with you guys to say thank you. I had an idea 12 years ago that was pretty far outside the box, and Paul specifically has really been in my corner since day one, with not a whole lot of track record in hindsight. So it's been wonderful to work with you guys. Thank you. So it's true, I'm an architect and I run a development corporation focused just entirely on small scale, multi-unit, urban infill housing. It's a pretty specific niche. It was pretty esoteric when I started. Public policy, though, has really shifted in the past 2-3 years, where this is one of the dominant forms of development that's being encouraged at the policy level. And there's really 3 common criterias to all of our projects. They're small as far as developments go. Everything is 2, 3, 4, 5 units, 1, 2, 3,000 square feet per front door, because they're simple to approve with the city, they're simple to finance, and it's a lot easier to design and deliver a product of higher quality at that scale. 2 or 3 of something seems to just always be better than 20 or 30 of the same thing in a row. There are always urban infill sites. We believe really strongly in the city of Toronto and the densest neighborhoods of Canada. Everything is always mid-block in a house-like building surrounded by other house-like buildings. It's always under Part 9 of the building code. It's always in an established neighborhood. And for us, that's usually been like the downtown west end of Toronto, but it always has to be in what planners call the yellow belt, that vast built area of low-rise housing in the cities. And then finally, they're pretty uncompromising on design and construction quality. So I really believe in not ever designing the same building twice. We're always experimenting with new materials, new building systems, lower embodied carbon, polishing out the processes, and then just iterating towards simple, beautiful buildings. I wish it wasn't true, because it's a very time-consuming process from the design side. But if we redesign a building 20 times, it gets better on the 21st. And it gets better on the 22nd. And so we've learned to have a lot of faith in that process. It's like the opposite of cynicism about the development model, where well-designed, well-built housing will be appreciated by the market. And it's been hard to bring people along certain times, but it's really proven itself out. I graduated from the University of Toronto, Master's degree of Architecture in 2006. I started out as just a practicing architect at a firm designing very high-end custom homes, and pretty shortly afterwards shifted to another firm focused on condominium developments. You probably know those 2 worlds can be pretty dismissive of each other. One thinks the other is brainless, the other thinks the other is soulless. But I think there is a way to forge the best of both worlds, and after a few years I had my own license and tried to find ways to combine them to deliver nice housing for profit. It was pretty clear early on that to do that, we needed to control the construction process entirely, and to do that, we needed to control the financing entirely. So I really became a developer in order to deliver the architecture that I believed in. Like a lot of people my age in my industry, my wife and I bought a house in a downtown Toronto neighborhood for well under $500,000 when you could do that. Fixed it up, lived there, sold it for profit, enough profit to buy a similar lot outright. And after 2 years of looking at houses, we really started to notice these patterns of deep lots with rear lanes and increasingly rarer wide lots. Width really felt like a luxury. And if you stood in an 18-foot house, it was appreciably better than a 16-foot house. A 20-foot house was appreciably better than an 18-foot house. And I think the next speaker will talk about this in a little more detail, but there's a book that came out at that time by Bridget Shim called Sight Unseen, which became really foundational, I think, to a lot of people's thinking, to my thinking about housing development. That book was specifically focused on laneway housing, but there was an overarching philosophy that there's an existing urban infrastructure that can support tremendously more housing in unexpected, innovative, creative new ways. So we started buying those kinds of lots, large, undervalued, mid-block lots, and designing a housing type that really hadn't existed in Toronto at all before. Because you cannot take a 20-foot wide lot and split it in half down the middle. I've tried. There are a lot of authorities having jurisdiction over those processes. It's a non-starter for most of them. But you can absolutely design a duplex where somebody lives on one floor and somebody else lives above them. And in other cities, in Montreal, in London, in Brooklyn, cities that we knew, those things are nice and expensive. But we couldn't see a way where those would sell for money in Toronto. They really needed to feel like a house. And so around 2011, we realized that we couldn't split these lots down the middle, and we couldn't split them one over the other, but we could split them front to back. You can have somebody who owned an entire house from the basement up to the roof, and somebody else who owned the back half of the house from the basement up to the roof. And to the homeowners, it would feel a lot like they were living in a semi-detached house. You've got a party wall connecting you to a neighbor, but otherwise, it's really your house and sells at the market rate of houses in neighborhoods. So the next part was really to figure out how to sell each of those houses on a single piece of land to one purchaser. And this is where the high-rise experience came back. Because condominiumization, like a condominium to most people, is like an ugly, tall glass building with small units. And it's really just a process for collective ownership over a piece of land. And so we started condominiumizing these 2, 3, and 4 unit houses. The city was a little suspicious at first. There had been some previous 2-unit condominium registrations of carriage houses to separate them from large houses, but this model didn't really exist. But it's a process. It's like getting minor variances or building permits or anything else. So we navigated through it. And by the time that we had registered a condominium and set up reserve fund studies and boards and all these things, we had a bunch more in the pipeline. And it became evidence that a lot of the perceived fears never came to materialize. Whenever a house sells, some percentage of that sale price is for the house itself, and some percentage price is for the land. And there's a lot of variability, and it's pretty difficult to quantify which is which. But what became clear to us is that when we're selling these 2, 3, 4 unit condo homes, we get to sell each house, but we got to sell the land multiple times. And so that's really been the essence of this whole development thesis. Finding lots where we can resell the land over and over again afterwards. There's a lot of details in running, like any development corporation. How to recognize bad blocks in good neighborhoods and good blocks in bad neighborhoods, and hiring good people and keeping them happy, and financing and strategy and bookkeeping, and the municipal approvals process and the appeals to the municipal approvals process, and engineers and lawyers and lumber yards and HST exigibility, areas of refuge, the joys and hazards of the gray market economy. But really it's all about this more than anything else, finding a lot in an established neighborhood and buying it once and selling it twice. And from there we've really just scaled. So to recap, like from start to finish, we just buy mid-block residential houses in established neighborhoods, the densest neighborhoods in Canada, when they're oversized and undervalued. There's a lot of design energy into ensuring that what's built there, each unit feels like its own house. Entries are grade adjacent. There's nobody living above or below you. They feel like nice new houses in the neighborhood. And then controlling the construction process from start to finish in order to deliver quality, whatever that means to you. And meanwhile, taking that through a condominium registration process in order to sell each unit separately. And that's kind of it. It's like a few small sequential insights that have added up to quality additions to the city's housing stock year after year. Thank you very much for your time, and I can take questions. So how do the homeowners fare afterwards when it's just 2 or 3 civilians operating a condominium corporation? Yeah, there's a lot of variations. The worst case scenario is that one person's an idiot and the other one's an asshole. But like generally speaking, it's pretty simple, and we hand it over to them kind of wrapped in a bow. So we give them a bank account. We set up the condominium structure so that as much as possible, it's much more like a semi-detached house. So there's an audit in the first year, we do that for them, but look, it's just like 2 people have made a monthly contribution for 12 months, and if they've spent the money on something, they need to account for that. So it's pretty basic compared to much larger, more elaborate corporations. There's almost no common element, and there's no common element interior space at all, right? It's really my house and your house. So that helps to simplify it a lot also. There are minor like it can be difficult to open the correct type of bank account to secure insurance policies. So we hand it over to them. There's always a period of time where we own the condo corporation for a few days, weeks, months before they get sold and handed over. So we try and hand it over to them kind of wrapped in a bow. But now looking back at these 10-year-old ones, there's every variety of circumstance. Like some people run them very meticulously and diligently and make their reserve fund contributions, which are calculated under the guidelines of the Condominium Act to be the replacement cost of the structure amortized over 25 years. And that's great. There's also people who have kind of like pretended that they don't live in a condo. And that's turned out to be basically okay too. When it comes time to sell your unit, which you have the right to do because it's your condo, the purchaser's gonna ask for like a statement to demonstrate that the reserve fund is adequate, and it's not going to be, and you're gonna disclose that, and it will have an effect on the purchase price, but as a percentage of the asset itself, it's really negligible. And so we found that even the people who have been the least diligent in maintaining a proper condominium corporation, the downside's been basically non-existent. It's just been a way to create more front doors. There's so many variations. So 4 is a really great number because you're not required to pay development charges now on anything with 4 units or less. So we find the best mix for 4, we've just done like a 25-foot lot, we're now doing a 29-foot lot, is to do 3 in the main building and a laneway suite. But to do 4
side by side
would be like in the 30 to 32-foot range.
the lot, the land.
The land, yes.
You can build 4 houses.
Oh yeah, yes. And we've done all kinds, like we have...
I gotta talk to you.
Sure, we have demolished row houses that are attached on both sides and constructed new buildings attached into them. There's a lot of logistics around doing the shoring and the underpinning and all of the construction work before demolition, and then just like removing your shell and putting a new thing on top. But yeah, there's a lot. Thank you. Yeah, please. Yes, please.
What's an ideal lot size if you want to build 4 beside each other?
For like, yeah, please.
I'm just curious about like the changes in single housing density. Like we're now, as of right, I think 3 units. And is there sort of like a sweet spot there in terms of density where there's a...
I think that whole number of like 2, 3, 4 units is a real sweet spot. One, from like a financing point of view, I think that's about as big as you can get without requiring pre-sales, which means you're going to be selling the finished units in the market you finish them in. And that's an upside that we're optimistic about always. I think also it's right around the scale where it's as big as it can be without feeling like a development. And we've always been able to sell our condominium units at the neighborhood housing price rather than at the like dollar per square foot condominium price. So I think that's been really important too from a scale point of view. 3 units is better than 2. 2 units is better than a single family house, but I think it starts to drop off very rapidly after that, or the sites become significantly more expensive. More profitable. In order to sell, like a 2-unit project will always be more profitable for us than building a single family house, and if we could put 3 units or 2 units on the exact same lot, the 3-unit pro forma just always plays out better because of the additional land component of the sale price every time. Absolutely not, no. I really think that if you're pre-selling, you're not getting paid for quality. You're just selling it on a commodity basis. And I think that we've always differentiated ourselves on design quality, on not feeling like a builder house. So even though we're building them speculatively, we're really finishing them. There's like 4 of us. Like these things are very built by hand, right? So there's a real sense of, it feels like a custom built house that was built for you, except that you didn't have to go through like the headache, risk, and pain of getting this thing approved and fighting with your neighbors and finding contractors. Like it's just done. And so it works more like a spec house, except there's a few of them. Yeah. Depending on the location, sometimes we're not required to provide parking spots anymore. But almost all of these sites have rear lane access with parking access from there. And we could get 3 spots into like a 31-foot lot. As soon as you introduce a laneway suite, you're relieved of the obligation to provide parking. I think for the most part, we consider it pretty important on the sales side. But like we have a recently completed project at Bloor and Ossington. It's at the intersection of 2 major transit hubs. So we provided 1 parking spot for 4 units and a ton of bike parking. And it seemed to really work. The unit with parking was more expensive. It didn't sell first, it sold. So I think depending on the location, there can definitely be less of a requirement for a lot of parking. Like the whole GFA of the house? Or I guess we'd get like 15 to 1,800 square feet, plus 1,500 square feet, plus a basement on a 32-foot lot. Oh yeah, they're all like 3 stories plus basements. Like they're tall, skinny, deep. On skinny, deep lots, sort of like in a coherent alignment with the built form around them. And we're dealing largely in neighborhoods where 3 to 4 units have always been permitted, where there'll be a mix of houses, semi-detached, row houses, townhouses, condominium developments, mid-block apartment buildings, religious buildings, all that. Like we're talking about dense neighborhoods exclusively. Yeah, there's a weird CMHC tipping point where they don't want to refinance buildings that have fewer than 5 units, and we don't want to undertake projects that have more than 4 units. So then it gets a little trickier. Like anecdotally, we have this 4-unit building that we completed at Bloor and Ossington. It's tenanted, and on the day that the tenants moved in, we're able to appraise it for something like $3.3 million on a cash flow basis. And on the day it was condominiumized, keep in mind every tenant was there paying the same rent at both times. The construction was completed at both times. They were 6 months apart. There was no substantial change. It was valued at $5.5 million. Like all that happened was we allowed there to be separate ownership of each of the units. And so this was the Bank of Nova Scotia appraisal. Like it's not overly inflated. So I think that there's just a huge amount of value unlocked in selling something that, I know starter homes are a really loaded term, but in like a starter home adjacent asset to an end user, I think will always be more valuable than a rental building at that scale. To what, like in order to sell each of the units separately? Yeah, yes, is the short answer. It gets complicated because almost every condominium is itself like a larger building that goes through a site plan approval process. And to go through a condominiumization is to go through an equivalent amount of scrutiny with the city. So all of a sudden, regulations you didn't previously have to comply with about turning radius to get into parking garage and landscape open area and storm water, retention galleries and all these things become requirements, although shockingly flexible ones. Like we found time and time again that we're able to say, look, like we went through the process. We met with the city, we explained what we were trying to do, we met with planning staff, they told us to get minor variances, we got minor variances, they told us to get a building permit, we got a building permit. All the engineers were in line, all the inspections and review were in line, we closed our building permit, we started this condominium registration, and now you're asking me to add 2 parking spots. Like the time to do that was 3 years ago. And it's very stressful for a period of time, but then like it always gets done. So there's not a lot of authority that anybody has to refuse a condominium registration, only to impose conditions. So when you sell a condominium, so condominium is basically a form of co-ownership of a land, right? Like if each of these tables was a condominium unit in the room, then like each person can own a table, but all of us together are going to take care of the room. You've got the right to buy and sell your table and put debt on it. You've got the right to buy and sell your table and put debt on it. But whoever you sell it to is going to also buy into an agreement with all the other tables that like we're going to replace the lights every 3 years and things like that. And so when I say you can sell the land multiple times, I mean, when we figure out how much each table is worth, part of it is going to be the value of the table, and part of the purchase price is going to be the value of being in this room. And so by getting more tables into the room, we're able to sell the room more times over. And that's what I mean when I say we're able to sell the land multiple times. That component of the purchase price multiplies out over multiple sales.